Well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to proceed into Chapter 2, and Chapter 2 is going to be ancient Mesopotamia. And in regards to ancient Mesopotamia, we're looking at a time period where we're moving out of that Neolithic ice age, the end of that ice age, where humans at that time, folks were settling, they were making structures, and they were deciding to stay in one local area. And from there, there's going to be more and more development of artwork and more techniques and designs that are happening in particular what is present day Middle East. And present day Middle East is Iraq. Mostly is where we're going to see a lot of this ancient Mesopotamian growth. And Mesopotamia itself actually means the land between two rivers. And if you look at map 2.1, you're going to see that there are two main rivers that kind of shelter and border the main areas of Mesopotamia, and that's the Euphrates and the Tigris. And all those little bullet points throughout those areas in between those two rivers are going to be little city states, and those little city states are going to start to rev up and become small kingdoms. And you have main areas that we're going to be talking about: the Assyrian area to the north, the Akkadian area in the middle, and then the Sumerian in the south, or down towards Uruk and Ur. And we'll start with the Sumerian, and then we'll work our way up, because down in that confluence where the Euphrates and the Tigris comes together, again in map 2.1 on the PowerPoint, you're going to see a lot of the generating aspects of ancient Mesopotamia. And what's really going to set off this ancient Mesopotamia from the Neolithic period is the development of Western civilization. And there are four main bullet points to the development of that of civilization. One is we're going to start to see writing, and one of the greatest epic tales comes from the Sumerian area, called the Epic Tale of Gilgamesh. And we're going to start to see actual recorded writing, and not just pictorial images, but actual writing. Also, we're going to have an increase in animal husbandry, as well as vegetable or vegetation and agriculture. That's going to be on the rise. There's also going to be the use of casting metals like copper and bronze, which is going to give more of a permanence to the artwork instead of relying heavily on stone and clay, which has a tendency to break and crack if not fired or protected in a proper way. And bronze is more lasting. It can be oxidized on the surface, so can copper, but still the overall form itself can be kept intact unless it's resmelted or remelted. And the last is personalized positions. Personalized positions and new duties and new tasks are going to be implemented. So when this new form of civilized government starts to develop in these city-states and small kingdoms, specific duties are going to unfold. And just to give you an example, the high priestess of the temples, and this is a polytheistic, these are polytheistic groups, so they believe in multiple gods. And the high priestess of certain temples, like the highest temple, like Inanna, that we'll see in Uruk, the high priestess is also the queen, so the queen to the king of that Sumerian city-state or kingdom. So dual roles, dual task, and people are going to start having more internalized, personalized positions within the community, instead of everybody going out and having to hunt and to gather and to plant crops and such for vegetation and agriculture. Those are going to be set aside for some folks, and then there's going to be more specific duties that are going to be necessary for the governance of these little city-states. So again, those four main things are really important whenever it comes to knowing why we consider this a civilization, and why we didn't necessarily consider the settlements of the Neolithic period as civilizations. Okay, so you have writing, you have increased husbandry in animals and in vegetation. You have personalized positions and duties developing through the governance of the city-states, as well as the use of learning how to use fire to smelt down metal. All right, so refer to map 2.1 to give you an idea of what the area looks like and where we're talking about in particular. Then in figure 2.1 is the first major form that we need to start discussing and talking about, and it's called the work of Vase. And what's important about the work of Vase is it starts to show us that there is this interest in symbolizing writing by there being a difference. So I'm going to be breaking these down based off of these four main points and components to what makes civilization. So the writing is broken down into these images and these symbols, and you can see that in all these different sections of the work of Vase. And each section is a timestamp of activity and duty, and they're called registers. So the bottom is a lower register with the animals and the vegetation. Then there's a space of emptiness, which is that of time passing. Then there's the duties of the males that have no clothing on, that are bringing the offerings from the animals, from the bodies of the animals as well as the vegetation. Then there's another blank register, and then the top register is the high priestess giving those offerings that were brought to her and left outside of the temple for Inanna, and she's the only one who's qualified to deliver those offerings to the goddess Inanna. So each section has different aspects of the duties, the animals, the vegetable duties, which are the suppliers of food. Then you have the males, which are the suppliers of bringing the harvest to the temple doors. And then the upper duty is the high priestess taking on the role of giving the offerings to the goddess within all of these registers. And then in the very top, as I was mentioning at the beginning, is the writing element of there being different symbols that are abstracted in nature or much larger in nature to show the importance of how much abundance is being played into the offering to Inanna from the high priestess. So the work of Vase is very much the staple to how we see and portray what civilization was looking like during this ancient Mesopotamian time. Then figure 2.2 is the White Temple in Uruk, where it is modern day Warqa, Iraq, and this is where we find the work of Vase. And this is what the temple structures look like during this time. It's very eroded down because they haven't quite figured out how to use fire for the mud brick that they're doing to do the dry masonry of the White Temple. But they're going to learn this technique very quickly, and they are going to learn how to fire the mud brick, which is essentially clay, and make it stronger. And in its strength, we'll see later on in a ziggurat temple that it's more withstanding, and it has a more permanence to it because that clay has been hardened and what's called vitrified, so that it's not broken down or eroded away by the rains and the wind and different weathering. But figure 2.3 gives you an idea of what that White Temple, actually looked like when they used the mud brick before it was worn down over these thousands and thousands of years. And you can see that there's an upper plateau in which the temple sits upon, and that's where the offerings are left, and then the high priestess goes within the temple and does the proper worshiping to Inanna. Then figure 2.4 is a female head, which we believe is Inanna, and it's a good example of how they portrayed their goddesses and how they portrayed their gods. And if you notice that there's carving of hairline, but that is just a direction, a precursor on where they need to lay actual hair on top of this deity or this idol. And that's what they would do, is that they would inlay hair and jewels in the brow, as well as hair on the top of the head, and then most likely in the sockets of the eyes you would have more brilliant gems that have been popped out and probably stolen from robbers over the years. But they would actually clad or don their deities or their idols with human clothing, as well as with actual human hair. That's why you have that bifurcation or that septum there in the middle where they would impact hair and let it rest down around the side of the face. So they would dress their deities on a daily basis, give them fresh clothing, fresh hair, make everyone feel like their presence is there within the temples. And this is something that still happens in India. A lot of the Hindu or Vaishnava temples in India have this kind of feature involved, where they dress their deities on a daily basis, sometimes 3 to 4 times a day. And then figure 2.5 are little statuettes of worshipers, showing an interest on who's actually worshiping these god and goddesses. And in this case, it's in the temple of Eshnunna. And in the temple of Eshnuna, you have these two figures, and you can see that the female is placed in front of the male because the worshiping aspect to these goddesses and goddesses was a very matriarchal process. And so these statuettes are placed in a way in which they were found, where she is in the front, he is in the back. Because it shows that kind of matriarchal hierarchy of worshiping. They really ran the show whenever it came to the temple worship and the direct connection with the gods. And you can see their eyes are very abstracted and very large, so they're learning how to not only make these figures, and if you refer back to some of the figures that we saw in Jericho in Neolithic period, the advancements have really taken off. You can see that there's definitely more of a development in the aesthetics of human anatomy and the features involved thereof. There's a couple things in particular that I want you to really focus on, and that's the beard and the hair and the patternization on the male figure in the back to the left, and that's going to become a very prominent pattern feature and design that we'll see throughout Mesopotamia, as well as how it will influence the Egyptians as well as the Greeks as we start to move forward into Western art history. And also with the feminine statuette, with the female statuette, I want you to focus on what's called organic drapery. And that organic drapery coming down off of the left shoulder of her body is supposed to signify this layering of fabric. And you can see that her left elbow is protruding out a little bit from behind those thin carvings of that fabric. So those two things in particular with these statuettes, well, three things: the wide eyes, the pattern of the kinky hair on the male figure and the beard, as well as the organic drapery that's coming down off the left shoulder of the female statuette, are really going to be key to know and to focus on whenever it comes to how that's going to influence the rest of Mesopotamia and throughout the rest of the future histories of Western art. Here, figure 2.6 is the next one that we're going to look at. And figure 2.6 is to show the intricacies of woodworking that they were developing to go alongside a lot of different ceremonies that were taking place throughout different city-states or kingdoms. And it's very intricate, and it's probably the best artisans and the best artists that were used to design these musical instruments. And you can see that layering and that texturing of symmetrical patterns on the beard of the bull head in the front right, again, is reflective of that statuette that we saw previous with the worshiping figures. What's really going to be interesting about the bull head is, if you recall, in the Paleolithic and Neolithic time, is that the bull was like the guiding star, so to speak, or the leader that the humans would follow to find the reindeer and to find the vegetation. And so they were like their guides or their rulers, as they were very nomadic and kind of transient in nature. But now that they're settling down, they still have this reverence to the bull, but they're going to start transitioning that reverence of the bull over to rulers, Mesopotamian kingdom rulers. And we're going to see, like in figure 2.7, in the top register, there is the ruler. And he has the head with the beard and the hair, which is very reflective of the three-dimensional bull's head that we see in figure 2.6. And then also alongside him, adjacent and in symmetry, are two bulls that he's hugging and he's holding. And you can see that they have his head with the bull horns, and then he has his face and his head. So it's showing this transition from the bovine guide to now this human guide, and they're making themselves on the same platform as the bull, which is a subliminal way and a kind of an element of propaganda to show that their Mesopotamian ruler is now the new way of following. And so that's what's happening there in the upper register of another sound box that was found in another royal burial pit. Also, I want you to keep in mind of the use, that composite perspective that I mentioned at the very beginning with the first few videos. And that again is that twisted perspective where it's mostly in profile, but there's also elements that are frontal. And if you look at that king-like figure in the top register, the top section, you can see his lower body's in profile, his upper body is frontal, and so is his head. So those twisted and composite perspectives are going to be very important to relate to the ruling characters and the ruling people at that time. And that's going to become very prominent, mostly in full profile, whenever we get into Egyptian art and Egyptian canons, which are called standardizations. Then they use something called coniforms. That's C-U-N-E-I-F-O-R-M. Coniforms. And these are scripts that they're going to use to start to develop these stories using different symbolism, or what appears to be symbolism to us, but it's actually a fashion of symbolic writing. And figure 2.8 shows one type of coniform. And again, it's that registration where you have one section on top and another narration on the bottom. And you can see that they've used a stone, a cylinder seal, to roll upon a piece of clay, almost like printing, like a Xerox machine. And they would roll out the clay with this stone, and then they would fire it, and then they would distribute this information upon the city-state as well as throughout other city-states to kind of give like a newspaper or a journalistic awareness of what's going on within the kingdom of that city-state. So it's very much like a printmaking process, or like a Xeroxing process, or a publication process. So this is a image transfer technique where they carve the image into the cylinder stone, roll it on clay, and what is negative in the cylinder stone becomes a positive in the clay impression. All right, so that's called a coniform script. So it's a script. And one thing that I do want to mention in this in particular is what's called hierarchical scale. Hierarchical scale is the attempt to make one figure in the narrative or in the scene appear much larger. And that indicates that that person is the most prominent or the most important person in that room or in that location. And most of the time it's going to be like the king or the queen, and they're going to have a much higher physical stature and height than everybody else. So in figure 2.8, if you look low in the center, you can see that the head or the crown of this figure sitting down is almost breaking these register lines, which means that if that person would stand up, they would tower like 3 or 4 times, maybe 2 to 3 times bigger than the other folks that are there with him. So hierarchical scale is going to be a new technique that's going to move into Egypt and also Greece, well, mostly Egypt, to show kind of the importance of the higher class at this time. And the standard of which is figure 2.9, is a good example of that. You can see that hierarchical scale present in the center top. It's very obvious who the main figure is, who the ruler is. In this case, it is the king, and this is the war side, so this is during battle. And you can see that it's gotten even to the point where his crown is breaking the border completely around the register, almost as if he's this divine earthly ruler, which is what they were trying to promote, is this idea that they were sent there by the divine gods and goddesses to rule that area of the world, to the point where they even break from the material world. And so if you think of that border that is inlaid around the king's head as the material or earthly realm, he's breaking away from it with that crown that he's wearing. So it's a way to signify that his placement there on earth is more than just an earthly decision. It's a divine decision brought down by their gods and goddesses. And you can see it again on figure 2.10, which is the reverse side of the peace side. You can see the top left corner is going to be this tall figure if he would stand up, and his head again is breaking through the border. So indicating that he is beyond that earthly realm, that he is a divine earthly king in a human form that's been placed there by the god and goddesses. Another thing that's really interesting about this is if you go in that top register and go all the way down to the right, you see the musical instrument, that sound box, being played during this time of peace and during this banquet scene. And you can see the size of that musical instrument from the second figure down from the right on the top register. So it shows you how this is evidence and record for us art historians to see how these musical instruments were actually used. Figure 210 and figure 29, which is the same piece, the standard of is a coniform script, but it's an inlaid attempt, meaning that they're inlaying all these different materials of lapis, lazuli, shell, and red limestone inside of the wood. So they've carpentриed the wood, and now they're inlaying lapis, shell, and red limestone in it to make this coniform script. And then figure 211 is another coniform script, and this is a carved in relief coniform script. And the top section is what's really interesting, because you have a tablet design that's being developed, in that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 heads on the top, and then there's 18 or 16 feet underneath this rectilinear shape, and that indicates probably 8 warriors, right? But excuse me, in the middle, in between the heads and the feet, in that rectangle is a series of what looks like 24 hands and 24 spears and 48 hands. So they haven't quite developed how to create depth and to show the sheer number of infantry or army or warriors that were following the king, because they hadn't quite developed that technique yet. So what they do is they create kind of this abacus, or this tablet or tally-like tablet attempt on this coniform script to indicate to us how many numbers were actually there. So even though it's really supposed to be 24 and there's only 8 heads, we believe that each figure, each warrior, represents like a certain number in a brigade, let's say like 50 or something like that. And then each head is supposed to represent that 50, when there's actually hundreds and hundreds of warriors there following the king. And now how we know it's King Inannatum is because of the size. Again, that hierarchical scale. He is almost as big as 2.5 to 3 warriors, and his placement is in the top register on the far right. And you can see that he's leading the pack. He's leading his warriors into battle, and his size is much greater than that of even almost 3 of his warriors behind him. And then also in the lower register, you can see he's on a chariot, and he's also much larger in stature than the rest of his warriors behind him on the ground. So again, that's that hierarchical scale that's being used. Then in figure 212, we have the head of an Akkadian ruler, and this is the first use of the casting in bronze. Or I'm sorry, not in bronze, the casting in copper. And the casting in copper was what's called a substitution process. So they're taking a wax material, they're sculpting it in wax, and then they are going to cast or pour copper, in this case, into this mold that is encasing and encapsulating the wax. The wax burns out, and then the positive copper remains, and then they break the mold open, they clean it up, and then figure 212 is an example of that casting process. And remember that casting with molten metal is one of the staples to Western civilization, and this is an example of that. And what I'm going to do on this video is I'm going to end with figure 212, and I'm going to do another video, so all these aren't incredibly long. But what I want you to focus in regards to figure 212 is the patternization on his beard, how symmetrical it is. I also want you to look at his smile, and then start to see all these intricate details that are very realistic and naturalistic that they're able to do. And I'll pick up on this in the next video, and then we'll conclude and move on into the end of chapter 2. All right? I'll see you all soon in the next video.